What if Zoro fought all of Luffy's opponents? That's exactly what we're here to talk about today, and I just want to make things absolutely clear because I feel like there was sort of a little confusion in the last video I did like this. So what we're discussing is, at the time that Luffy fought each and every one of his opponents, imagine Luffy was switched out and Zoro was switched in at whatever strength level he was at the time that Luffy fought them. And of course, we're going to take everything into account, each side's strengths and weaknesses to try to assess how these matches will go if they actually happen in the story. So let's take things from the top with Luffy's first official opponent, which was Alvita. Now, when Alvita attacked Luffy, he tanked her mace like it was nothing, like it was a blunt attack almost. Although her mace had spikes, it didn't really affect Luffy at all, and he just absorbed the contact. So maybe this was because she was too weak to actually affect Luffy in any way that, he would suffer significant damage. Although that might be the case, I don't think Zoro would take this attack in the same way. I don't think he would handle it in the same fashion. I think Zoro would just dodge her and then immediately attack her and defeat her in one attack. Because Zoro is that fast, of course, and he does have attacks of that power with the ability to one-shot Alvita. Luffy did it with one of his most basic punches, so Zoro, even if he needed some mid-tier attack from his arsenal, he would defeat her in one blow with no issue whatsoever. Now, the big thing with Alvita is she was able to strike fear into some of the people on her crew, like Kobe, because she was big, strong, and just way over them physically. But that wouldn't work on Zoro and Luffy. Zoro and Luffy been training their whole lives, basically, and they're just leagues and leagues above her in that category, and she wouldn't be able to use that to her advantage. Now, moving on to the next opponent, we have the beast tamer Moji and his lion Richie. And off the bat, you could tell that Moji's only real advantage here is the fact that he has control of Richie. By himself, Moji's not a threat in any capacity whatsoever. But if you're fighting these two, the one thing you have to watch out for is the fact that Richie has insane biting ability. So much so that he was able to break the cage that Luffy was trapped in with one bite. And this was long before Luffy had put together any gears or before Zoro gained the ability to just cut this sort of cage clean. So if Zoro was going to go up against Richie and Moji, he would have to watch out for Richie's bite because he surpasses him in physical strength. Or rather, Richie's bite surpasses Zoro's physical strength. So if he got caught, he would die in one blow. But the great thing about it is, on top of Moji not having any combat ability of his own, Richie's not fast, he's very uncoordinated, he's just raw power with no sort of coordination. So this would be very easy for Zoro to dodge and counter quickly and defeat in one hit. Immediately after these two opponents, we have their captain, Buggy. Now, the thing with Buggy is he had the entire town terrified because of his weaponry and his devil fruit. They had no idea what devil fruit power was. They didn't know the ins and outs of what devil fruit ability could do. So this scared off the town folks with his ability to move around his severed limbs and of course his buggy bombs. They had the ability to level the whole town all at once. They were very, very destructive. If one had landed on Luffy, he would have died because they were that destructive. They were that powerful. Luffy, when one was thrown at him, he was able to deflect it back immediately because of his rubberness. Zoro wouldn't have this advantage, so he would have to find some other way to evade it. And I don't think this is too tall of a task. I think he has the ability to evade the bomb altogether. What's important is, like Luffy, that he sees the destructive power behind it and sees why it's important to avoid this bomb at all costs. But then, with the explosive weaponry aside, Luffy also had the one-on-one fight with Buggy, and in that fight, he was able to gain the advantage for short moments, but then he had moments where, while he was stretching to attack Buggy, he left himself at a huge disadvantage because he increased the area of attack for Buggy. So Buggy could have just as easily severed his limbs in this moment. Zoro, in this case, he wouldn't have this disadvantage because he's a close-range fighter and he fights with his weapons, so his weapons will block a lot of Buggy's attacks and he wouldn't have to sustain that damage himself, even if Buggy did get close. But of course, this doesn't mean that Buggy can't attack him at all because Buggy, of course, would be able to land some attacks. The biggest thing in this case though is the fact that sword attacks do not work on Buggy, or the sword attacks that Zoro was able to do at this time. He didn't have any way to damage Buggy. Any slice he attempted, Buggy would just reform. Now, admittedly, before rereading the fight, I figured, why doesn't Zoro just put his sword to the side and just punches away at Buggy until he knocks him out? But that wouldn't work, honestly, because number one, Luffy used one of his stronger punches at the time against Buggy, and although Buggy took damage, he was able to recover from it and then bounce back. He was ready to go and ready to keep fighting. In fact, he would have defeated Luffy if Nami didn't intervene and tie up his body parts. So if you put Zoro in this situation, number one, his attacks would be far less effective, and number two, Buggy has great endurance to keep going even after he takes an attack like a punch. And Zoro's punches aren't as strong as Luffy's. Luffy has stronger punching power by benefit of his devil fruit. So Buggy would have the endurance to outlast Zoro and then sneak attack him in some way and take him out. So for the first time in these matchups, Zoro loses. And next we have Captain Kuro, who is very, very fast, especially when he uses his out of the bag attack, which gives him insane speed to the point that it's hard to even see him. But the thing with Captain Kuro is he's very overconfident with his abilities and not very calculated. So over the course of his movements, he becomes predictable. And so in the middle of his out of the bag attack, Zoro would eventually be able to perceive him and then land a finishing blow with a 3-sword attack. And next we have Krieg, and with Krieg there were a lot of similarities with Buggy in the fact that he used a lot of external weaponry to gain the advantage on his opponents. The one big difference is the fact that Krieg did not have a devil fruit or anything, and when he fought Luffy, he tried to sink him knowing that the fact that Luffy had a devil fruit would be to his disadvantage if he landed in the water. He can't do that with Zoro. If he sinks Zoro, Zoro will just swim right back up. But one thing that they're both susceptible to is the fact that Krieg has poison gas, and Zoro in that situation would have to rely on one of the gas masks that were around to withstand the poison long enough in order to continue the battle. But once that's out of the way, I could see a number of avenues that Zoro could take up in order to defeat Krieg. He can overcome him through agility, physical force, or just sheer endurance. And by this point, Zoro had already showcased how crazy his endurance was with the fact that he was able to fight Axe-Hand Morgan and successfully defeat him despite the fact that he had not eaten for over a week. And on top of that, he was able to overcome Cabbagey despite having a wound right on his side from Buggy. The way Luffy was able to defeat Krieg was the fact that he was able to force his way through his spiked armor and punch him so hard that it knocked him out. And we see that Luffy was able to do this despite a bit of damage. It may have been minimal, but it still was something that he felt. You put Zoro in a situation and he may not have to deal with this because he's an armed combatant. So that might be one advantage that he would have over Luffy in this case. And ultimately, no matter what the difficulty, he will come out on top and defeat Don Krieg. And next, we get to Arlong. Now, the thing about this is Zoro and Arlong actually had an encounter in Arlong Park after Zoro had defeated Hachi. And the biggest thing to take into account is the fact that Zoro was severely injured to the point that he was losing so much blood. He still had that wound from Mihawk. He was able to fight through that wound and the blood loss to defeat Hachi because Hachi just wasn't on his level. He was an absolute baby to him. There was no chance for Hachi to defeat Zoro in that situation, no matter how injured he was. Arlong though was on an entirely different level, and there was no way he was going to defeat him without being at full health. So if we're going to take Zoro as he was at that time, after having just come off of the fight against Hachi, he would have been destroyed very easily with no chance of survival. But honestly, the greater purpose of this video is to see how Zoro would fare at his best against his opponents that Luffy faced, you know, since we're comparing their overall abilities. And what stands out to me the most is the fear in Arlong's eyes when he saw how serious Zoro's wound from Mihawk was, and the fact that he was able to keep fighting and withstand it and not die, because of course these were injuries that will kill a normal man. Not only were they serious enough that not only would another person not be able to stand, they would just be outright dead. So Arlong told himself, I have to kill this man at all costs. I can't let this man live, because what can he do at full health? So that alone tells me that Zoro was more powerful and in normal circumstances would defeat Arlong. And so for that, I'm giving Zoro this dub over Arlong. And next we have Mr. 3. Looking at things through the lens of Luffy's fight, Luffy couldn't even win without the help of the others in formulating a plan to take down Mr. 3. They had to already be hostages for him to even win. Were it not for those wax candles, the entire crew may have perished to Mr. 3. So if we're comparing Mr. 3 to Zoro in this case, number one, he already has Zoro trapped. So if he catches Zoro in a one-on-one, he traps him with the wax. Zoro will be unable to escape, because at this point, Zoro was unable to cut steel and his wax was as hard as steel. So taking that into account, Mr. 3 wins this matchup. And next we have Zoro versus Crocodile, and this is one of those matchups where it can go any number of ways. You can cook up a variety of circumstances and outcomes to give one side or the other the victory. On the surface, it might sound easy enough to say, why doesn't Zoro just wet his blades and just defeat Crocodile just like that? But it is absolutely not that easy, especially because it's not like Zoro's gonna come into the fight knowing Crocodile's weakness. And the fact of the matter is, Luffy could have easily and probably should have died to Crocodile. There were many chances for Crocodile to get the killing blow on Luffy in the first encounter, but then Crocodile was kind of laid back, lazy. He was kind of trying to flex his powers. And then when he got serious, Luffy was in the right place at the right time with the right circumstances to bounce back and come back to fight Crocodile again. He got 3 shots at Crocodile. Not only is this too close to call as it is, but there were certain things that only Luffy could do that helped carve out the path for him to win this fight. For example, during round 2, while Luffy was about to lose, he expelled water out of his body, shot it into the air. Crocodile, thinking this was an attack that was meant for him, did not know Luffy sent this water up in the air for it to come back to his body while he dropped to resuscitate him, to put that moisture back into his body. This helped Luffy bounce back and come back for round 3. Zoro doesn't have a tactic like this, and he wouldn't be able to hold the water in his body and fight the way Luffy was fighting, because it was Luffy's rubberness that helped him do all of this. So all things considered, Zoro wouldn't have any advantages or anything that would give him a good enough chance to win this fight. And so this matchup goes to Crocodile. Alright, next we have Bellamy, and with Bellamy, he wasn't really all that much of a threat. His combat skill wasn't special at all, there was really nothing to fear. Zoro took a beating from him at Luffy's request, but if he was the one to fight Bellamy, just like Luffy, he would defeat him very quickly. There would be very minimal effort involved, so it may even be a one-shot. So Zoro comfortably takes this matchup against Bellamy. Okay, now we get to Skypiea, and we have Zoro versus Enel. And this one should be pretty obvious. You know, Zoro, as a matter of fact, Zoro actually already fought Enel, and he lost badly. Now, most people don't agree with me here, but I believe Zoro was the only one who could have defeated Mr. 1 in Alabasta. I think if Luffy faced Mr. 1, Luffy would have lost. I think that's just a nightmare matchup for Luffy. And in this case, similarly, Luffy being a rubber man was the only person on that island, was the only one who could have defeated Enel. And the thing with Enel is he wasn't any kind of special skilled combatant or anything like that. He just had an insanely powerful devil fruit, and the fact that he was a Logia made him extremely difficult for non-Haki users to deal with. You can imagine if Bellamy was a Logia, despite his lack of skill, he may have still given Luffy and Zoro hell. And in the same way, Enel, lacking skill but having an insanely powerful Logia devil fruit, gave Zoro hell. And he would still give Zoro hell if Zoro was his main opponent, given the circumstances of Skypiea, you know, because Zoro didn't have any sea stone cuffs or anything that he could contend with. So of course this matchup goes to Enel. Now we're getting into the Water 7 and these lobbies matchups, and the first one I want to talk about is Zoro versus Bluno. And this is at the time that Luffy defeated Bluno and Zoro's strength level at that time. Although Luffy used Gear Second, his power up, to defeat Bluno, I think it might actually be debatable that Luffy even needed it to defeat Bluno himself. I think the advantage with it was to defeat him quickly, but if he fought him in base, he may have still won, but it would have taken a lot longer. But in Zoro's case, I don't think he needs Ashura. I think he can defeat him with his base ability that he fought Kaku with. Just comparing the Doriki, you can tell there's a gargantuan gap in their strength level. Bluno's was 820 and Kaku's was 2200. Of course, this was only physical strength, but with a gap that large, it can't be ignored. I don't think Bluno had anything in his arsenal to make up for it. On top of that, that was only measuring Kaku's base strength. It didn't measure his Zoan strength, and Zoro was overpowering that Zoan strength. So if he was to face Bluno, he might treat him like fodder outright. So this matchup goes to Zoro. And next we have Zoro versus Lucci, and this is a matchup I think even Luffy could have easily lost. He was on his last legs and almost out for the count, and if it wasn't for Usopp motivating him to get back up and keep fighting, he may have not surpassed his limits and gotten ahead and defeated Lucci. There's a few things I want to take into account though, one of them being the fact that Luffy was overusing Gear Second, and that might have attributed to his condition when he was on his last legs against Lucci. And as I mentioned earlier, I think Zoro can fight on that level or a similar power level as Luffy was when he was using Gear Second without sacrificing so much of his body. But then you have to consider the attack power of Gear 3 and if it surpasses Ashura and how much it surpasses Ashura. And then there's also the question of whether or not Lucci can withstand Ashura, and I think he can withstand it. I don't think he'll go without taking damage, but at the same time, I don't think it's going to put him down. I think he can fight through Zoro using this attack and keep going. Overall, I think this matchup is a lot closer than people think, although I think it's one of those situations where everything had to go right and Luffy almost lost to Lucci. So given all of that, I think it might be too difficult of a task for Zoro to overcome himself. So this matchup goes to Lucci. Of course, now we're moving on to Thriller Bark, and we have the matchups with Oars and Moria, and in this case, Zoro and the Straw Hats had to stall Oars until Luffy got back. This Luffy was hundreds of times stronger, far surpassing anything the Straw Hats could do as a collective. And that's because he had all these hundreds of shadows of skilled combatants thrust into his body and made him a completely different fighter himself. So if it was a situation where Zoro had to take on these shadows to gain this new power to defeat Oars and Moria, I don't think he can do that. I don't think he has the ability to withstand all these shadows being put inside of him, nor do I think he had the ability to contend with Oars and Moria with the power level that he had at that time. And on top of that, after Luffy had gotten to his normal form, he was able to force out the thousands of shadows outside of Moria when he had gotten, gigantic and everything. And this was only possible because Luffy's attacks are force-based. They apply immense physical pressure, and a sword attack in this case wouldn't have done the same job. So all things considered, Zoro at that time would have lost to Oars and Moria. And next we're moving on to the Summon War Saga, and the first matchup that I want to touch on is Zoro versus the Boa sisters. And with them, they were Haki fighters, but they lacked so much physically that a skilled physical fighter could overpower them. And that's what we saw with Luffy. Luffy also had immense speed that he used against them, so you can imagine Zoro can take them down with something like a lion song. And I don't think the Boa sisters had anything that would give Zoro a hard time. Maybe initially the observation haki would throw him off, but I think that's something he can adapt to very quickly given his skill set. So naturally this matchup goes to Zoro. And then moving along the Summer War Saga, we move to Impel Down, and that's where Luffy fought the Minotaur. And I think initially Zoro would underestimate it just like Luffy did, and he wouldn't put his all into attacking. But once he sees how good the endurance and recovery of this beast is, he would understand what he has to do and he would defeat it. Still in Impel Down, we move to a much more challenging matchup, and that's Zoro versus Blackbeard. And to be quite honest, I think Zoro will perform better than Luffy did, and that's mainly because Luffy is a devil fruit fighter and Blackbeard was able to immediately take advantage of this, catch Luffy off guard and slam him into the ground, turning off his devil fruit to his surprise. So Zoro might be able to get off more attacks, he might be able to do more damage, but in the end he loses all the same because Blackbeard was just on an entirely different level overall. He might be clumsy, but he was still a skilled fighter and someone who was able to take down Ace. But then we also have to talk about Magellan, and Magellan was someone who was able to defeat both Blackbeard and Luffy. And the thing about it is, I still think Zoro has an advantage, not a great enough advantage, but one that will allow him to get off more attacks and actually land them. And that's his ability to use air slashes. In the end, he will be overwhelmed just like with Blackbeard, but I think it will be slightly closer because of Zoro's ability to use air slashes and avoid Magellan's poison. There's Marineford next, but I don't want to spend too much time on that because there's too many overwhelming matchups that Zoro couldn't overcome, like Akainu and Mihawk. The only people that I think Zoro would destroy himself are the Vice Admirals. Well, certain Vice Admirals, because I don't think he would have been able to defeat Smoker or anyone like that. But there were plenty of people in Marineford that Zoro would have just ran straight through with no issue. And with that, we've reached the end of the pre-time skip matchups and the halfway point of this video, as a matter of fact. While we're here, I'd like to say if you've enjoyed this video so far, feel free to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell for more videos like this. Also, for any matchups you might agree or disagree with so far, feel free to comment your opinions on that down below. And of course, once we get to the end of the video, you can add to that as well. So with all of that out of the way, let's move on to the post-time skip. And the very first matchup is one that already happened, but it didn't have time to go the full distance. Zoro was able to fight Hodi underwater, and he was able to even overwhelm him with the disadvantage. He wasn't able to hold his breath long enough to put Hodi down. Put Zoro in Luffy's position and give him a full drawn-out fight in which he's able to use all his abilities and put him up against Hodi at the time where he had taken on a lot more drugs and got amped. I think Zoro would handle this very, very well. I think the biggest issue, which becomes an issue a lot of the times in the series, is the fact that plot shackles were sort of holding back Luffy because he could have taken care of Hodi very quickly if he used all of his abilities like Gear 4. But Gear 4, of course, had to be saved up for Dressrosa. So if Zoro was the one to face Hodi, can you imagine what a billion-fold world would do to him? If it did all that it did to Pika, imagine what it would do to Hodi Jones at this stage of the game. Personally, I think this would have been enough, but maybe, you know, you can make the case that he would have needed to go further, tap into more power to actually put him down for good. But I don't think there's any chance of Zoro losing. In fact, I feel like at this point, he was more advanced at armament mastery than Luffy was. So that scene where Luffy was talking about how his armament wasn't good enough yet to protect against attacks like Hodi was using, I think those attacks would have been far less effective against Zoro, and perhaps may have not been effective at all because I think his armament was significantly better than Luffy's at this point, being that he was an armament specialist. Now going on to Punk Hazard, we have Zoro versus Caesar, and with this one, Caesar of course is a very tricky opponent given his gas abilities. Given the right circumstances, he can kill very powerful opponents he would otherwise be overmatched by. I think Zoro has the right tools to handle this sort of fighter though. Number one, this is the post time skip. Although Caesar is a low gear, Zoro has armament haki, which would help him deal with Caesar. And on top of that, he has Dragon Twister, which I think would be a nice advantage to have because not only can he attack him with air slashes from a distance, he can also attack Caesar in a way that expels all of the gas that Caesar is using in his body away from Zoro with armament haki coated on top of it. Might even get a little tricky at some points, but I think this is the matchup that Zoro is very well equipped for, so he will ultimately take down Caesar. Now we could jump into the Coliseum. That's where Luffy faced Hajrudin, and I'm not gonna lie, I think Zoro can take on Hajrudin without even using his swords. I believe Zoro has more physical strength than Hajrudin does, despite being a giant. And honestly, Hajrudin is not that impressive for a giant. He's in fact much younger than the average giant. You can even consider him a kid. He might be extremely, insanely strong to a normal human, but to Zoro and Luffy, he's not all that. Zoro takes this one. And now this is where things get really interesting because we have Zoro versus Doflamingo, and I feel like what I have to say on this matchup might be controversial to some people. Firstly, I want to say I think there's many hints throughout the post time skip that show that Oda did not want Zoro going all out under any circumstances. And why is that? I feel like it's because of Ashura. I think Ashura was just far too powerful for Zoro to use at any point before Onigashima. And what never really made any sense was the fact that Sanji and Luffy were spamming their Enies Lobbies power-ups. Luffy was using gear 2nd all the time, gear 3. Sanji was using Diable Jambe left and right, but not a single time did Zoro use Ashura. Not until he faced off against one of the top 5 strongest fighters in the series, and that was Kaido. Something that's up for debate is what sort of attack was Ashura. There's the case to be made that Ashura is a Conqueror's coded attack. Either way, it's a very powerful attack and much more powerful than any of the other attacks we saw before Onigashima. It was so powerful that it was able to permanently scar Kaido. By comparison, something like Gamma Knife was nothing more than a nuisance to Kaido. Look at Gamma Knife's portrayal on Dressrosa and it nearly killed Doflamingo. Had Doflamingo not had the devil fruit that he had, he may have very well been dead right then and there. But he did, and he was able to stitch back together his organs. What if it was Ashura? What if he had to withstand Zoro's ultimate attack? I don't think he can. I think at that moment in time, in Dressrosa, if Zoro had gone all out, allowed to use his ultimate attack and everything, he would have defeated Doflamingo. On top of that, Oda had Zoro running after Doflamingo, but he protected him with an admiral. That used to be a thing we made jokes about, but at this point in time, I feel like it was a very real thing that Oda was actually protecting Doflamingo from Zoro, from the full skill of what he could do. You might take this as me saying Zoro was stronger than Luffy, and if it comes down to it, we can go with that no problem. Absolutely. Bottom line though, I think Zoro takes this matchup against Doflamingo at the time of Dressrosa. Alright, now let's move away from Dressrosa and into Whole Cake Island. The first matchup that comes into mind is the 1 versus Cracker, and of course we're not going to include Nami in this. Even though she helped out Luffy, we're trying to assess Zoro's strength against Luffy's opponents, not Zoro's ability to team up with others against Luffy's opponents, because that just doesn't help us at all. The first and most important thing is the fact that this is one of those matchups where people would probably go, do you really think Zoro can be somebody that Luffy needed help with? But that thinking is too one-dimensional. Not all fights are one-to-one. And also, even if Zoro did have Nami, she wouldn't be able to help him how she helped Luffy. Zoro wouldn't be able to eat up all the biscuits like Luffy was able to. But that's okay, because Zoro has his own strengths and his own ways of winning. And in this matchup, I think he would be better prepared to handle Cracker just because of the type of fighter he is. One weakness we saw that Luffy had in this fight is the fact that the moment he stretched out his arm too far, Cracker almost cut it clean. And that's a drawback of being an unarmed combatant, but it goes even further for Luffy because of how he stretches. Zoro having ranged attacks is an advantage, but also it's an advantage that he can do attacks like Dragon Twister that can keep going while he's attacking. How hard the biscuits are, it's one thing whether or not Zoro can cut them with his use of armament, but it's another thing for him to be able to just discard them entirely, because we saw how wide of an area Dragon Twister could cover. With that, he can just wipe out a whole bunch of them without even needing to necessarily damage them. And then with the potency of the attacks that he was using on Pika, he can take care of Cracker very quickly. And the thing with Cracker is he is not durable at all. He is a glass cannon. So attacks, especially bladed attacks, will be far more effective on him than they would be on people of his level. And this is because he has shied away from taking damage for so long that he didn't have a chance to build up his durability, because the more damage you take, the better your durability becomes. And the fact that he was hiding behind those biscuit soldiers for so long, it just made his durability and endurance very, very bad. All in all, Zoro takes this one. Now let's move to the other fight in Whole Cake Island, which is the fight against Katakuri. And straight from the jump, it's obvious Zoro wouldn't be as fast as Katakuri. At this stage of the game, post Dressrosa, Zoro is inferior, but that doesn't mean he's gonna lose, for one reason and one reason only. Luffy chose to overwhelm Cat with physical might, but he and Broly alluded to the other option, which is to outlast Cat, because eventually Future Sight runs out, and at that point it becomes a very different ballgame. Cat became so dependent on Future Sight that he just becomes a vastly inferior opponent without it. So what Zoro can do, he can outlast him until the Future Sight runs out, and then he can grind it out for the dub. Once Cat is no longer able to efficiently avoid attacks, his loss begins to approach very quick. And just like Cracker, he has an issue that he has avoided direct attacks for so many years, so he hasn't had the chance to build up his endurance. That's why whenever Luffy landed attacks, they looked very effective, even when Cat was able to get up armament haki. And on the other hand, Zoro has proved that he has high endurance, so he will without a doubt be able to last long enough for Cat's Future Sight to run out and for him to turn the tide of the game. So Zoro takes both matchups in Whole Cake Island. And now the final matchup for this video is Zoro versus Kaido. One thing I will say is that this fight can get a lot closer than people realize. I think Zoro's ability to grow is very underrated. With that said, I think the biggest drawback for Zoro is the fact that at the time of Onigashima, if if he used Enma too much, he would have died. And at the time, Enma was his only way to get acclimated with Conqueror's coding, so he had no other options other than Enma. So if Zoro tried it against Kaido, he would die one way or another. Because Luffy, with all the abilities that he gained, was the only one able to defeat Kaido at the time, especially Gear 5. He had a Haki Bloom with Conqueror's coding, came back significantly stronger to the point that he split the skies with Kaido, but still got manhandled moments later. And in Zoro's case, even if we were to use his current version, now on Egghead, I don't think he's quite there yet to the level he can defeat Kaido. I think there's one more step until he gets to that tier. So all things considered, I think Zoro loses this final matchup. And with that, we have reached the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching if you made it to the end. And as always, give me your thoughts down below. Tell me which matchups you agree with, which ones you disagree with, how you think each one will go. Comment all your thoughts down below, but also don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell for more videos just like this one.